The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer over Oak Creek Memorial's third-floor ICU, a sound Katie Morrison had stopped hearing 3 years ago. Antiseptic and burnt coffee mixed in the air like a perfume made for hospitals, sharp, chemical, overlaid with the desperate hope of people working graveyard shifts. It was 03 for 7 hours, the dead zone when the city outside was sleeping and the hospital was running on autopilot and coffee that had congealed into a substance resembling motor oil. Katie moved through room 312 with the efficiency of someone who had long ago learned that every motion mattered. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that didn't waste energy on gestures, no unnecessary movements, no flourishes, just the mathematics of medical necessity. The faded blue had faded further from 3 years of night rotations, bleached pale at the seams by industrial washers. Her right leg carried a slight limp that most people never noticed because she walked close to walls, and she always positioned her body so that walls were available. The patient in 312 was Mrs. Reeves, 73, post-op hip replacement, recovering well. Katie checked the cardiac monitor, steady rhythm, oxygen saturation 96%, blood pressure holding stable at 118/74. She made a note on the chart in handwriting that moved like precision machinery. No flourishes. No loops. Medical cursive stripped to its functional bones. She didn't notice Marcus Webb, the intake nurse, watching her from the doorway. He never did notice when people watched. That was a skill she'd learned in another life, a skill that had kept 40 men breathing through sandstorms and IED corridors in a place called Marjah, where the memory of her had been classified so deep that the government had erased her service records entirely. Marcus was newer, 6 months in, and he still had that expression nurses got when they watched Katie work. Not admiration exactly. Something closer to confusion. "How'd you get that for in on the second stick?" he asked as she passed him in the corridor. "Ultrasound guidance," Katie said. Her voice came out soft, the kind of soft that made people lean closer. Anatomical landmarks were compromised. The vein was mobile. "I tried landmarks. Just bounced off the wall." Katie didn't explain that she could feel a vein the way some people could feel rain coming. That her hands had started falls in moving vehicles while adrenaline was singing in her blood and the only light was muzzle flash. That in the last 3 years she'd started twice as many falls on the first stick as any other nurse on the floor, a statistic that nobody had mentioned in her annual review because it might have drawn attention, and attention was the last thing she needed. "Practice," she said instead. "You'll get there." He wouldn't. But he was kind, and kindness wasn't something Katie had learned in her first life. She'd learned it here, in these corridors, in the soft voices nurses used to calm families. She'd learned to make calloused hands gentle. That was when the ambulance bay doors opened downstairs, and she heard the sound of wheels on tile moving fast. Coded language crackled through the overhead speakers. "Trauma incoming. Male. Unconscious. No visible identification." The dispatcher's voice was carefully neutral, but Katie heard the question underneath it. Unknown provenance. Unknown status. Unknown everything. She was refilling medication carts when the patient arrived in room 347. She saw the intake nurse carry the paperwork past, a man, mid-40s, military-bearing, even unconscious, the kind of posture you didn't forget. And around his neck, visible for only a moment before it disappeared under the hospital gown, a single dog tag on a broken chain. The intake nurse didn't seem to notice it. People rarely notice things that didn't directly concern them. Katie noticed. The dog tag was worn. The chain had been broken at the link, not pulled, which meant impact rather than desperation. The tag itself caught the light for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction Katie's mind did something it wasn't supposed to do anymore. It translated. It remembered. It connected dots that had been scattered across 3 years of deliberately forgetting. She turned away. Turned back to the medication cart. Continued filling syringes in an order that nobody understood but her. Pain is information, her old instructor had said. Observation is data. She was collecting data again without meaning to, and that was dangerous. The night shift continued its mechanical rhythm. Monitors beeped. Ventilators wheezed their rhythmic push and pull. Fluorescent lights hummed their underscore. Katie moved through it all like a woman who had learned to be invisible by being useful, so consistently useful that noticing her became redundant. That was when Dr. Richard Ashford entered the ICU, and the entire floor's atmospheric pressure changed. He was the kind of man who changed rooms the way certain animals changed ecosystems. Tall. Expensive. The kind of expensive that whispered rather than shouted, a watch that cost more than Katie made in 3 months, shoes that had been handmade in Italy, cufflinks that caught light like they'd been cut from the sun. His presence moved through the ICU like a current through still water, and people reorganized themselves around it instinctively. Straighter spines. Quieter voices. Hands that moved faster. Dr. Ashford had been chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial for 16 years. He had the kind of authority that didn't require him to speak. His silence was more eloquent than most people's speeches. He moved through rounds the way a general moved through infantry, observing, assessing, judging. His opinions became policy. His preferences became law. The hierarchy didn't just acknowledge his position at the top, it worshipped it. He was performing teaching rounds with 3 medical students that morning. First year. Still wide-eyed, still believing that medicine was about healing rather than territory. They moved behind him like ducklings, pens poised over notepads, ready to transcribe whatever wisdom emerged from his mouth. Katie was checking the foresight on Mrs. Reeves when she heard his voice carry down the corridor. Not loud. Ashford never needed to be loud. His voice was the sound of confidence that had never been challenged, authority that had never been questioned, certainty that had calcified into something harder than bone. This is the 3rd floor ICU. As you can see, nursing staff manages the routine care, vital signs, medication administration, basic monitoring. Important work, of course. Necessary work. But let's be clear about the scope of practice. Nurses follow protocols. Doctors make decisions. He was speaking for the students, Katie understood. A performance about hierarchy. A demonstration of where everyone fit in the machine. The medical students nodded. They always nodded. Katie finished checking the 4 and made a note. Mrs. Reeves was sleeping, her face loose with medication, her body beginning the slow process of healing. There was nothing about her vital signs that required immediate action. Everything was stable. Everything was within parameters. Everything was proceeding according to medical mathematics. The group moved closer. Dr. Ashford's shadow fell across the doorway of room 312, and Katie felt the temperature of the room drop by degrees that only her body could measure. She didn't look up. Looking up would have been acknowledging him, and acknowledging him would have required her to take up space, and taking up space was something she'd learned not to do. Now, see here, Ashford said to his students, and Katie knew without looking that he was pointing to her. This is what we call proper nursing protocol. Note the deference to medical authority. The quiet competence. Exactly what we need from ancillary staff. Ancillary staff. Katie continued writing her notes. Her hand moved steady as a surgical laser. No tremor. No hesitation. No acknowledgement that she'd been categorized. The challenge with nursing staff, Ashford continued, his voice taking on the texture of someone sharing wisdom, is that without proper boundaries, they develop certain ideas about their scope of practice. Some of them begin to think they understand medicine. Some of them start making observations about treatment protocols or medication orders, as if they had medical school training. It creates confusion. It weakens the hierarchy that keeps patients safe. His eyes moved to Katie then. Not looking at her directly, but looking at her. The way a predator looked at prey that had stopped running. She felt his gaze the way you felt a temperature change, environmental, undeniable, requiring no direct acknowledgement. You never get that confusion here, Morrison, do you? It was her first time hearing him speak her name. The question wasn't a question. It was a test. It was a declaration. It was a promise that there were rules here, and she would follow them, and failure to follow them would have consequences that he had plenty of practice delivering. Katie turned a page in the chart. "No, doctor," she said. "Exactly," Ashford said, and she heard the smile in his voice. The satisfaction of a man watching something smaller than him confirm its own smallness. He moved on. The medical students moved with him, and the ICU settled back into its normal gravitational field. Katie finished her charting. She moved to the medication cart. She continued her night in the rhythm she'd perfected, invisible, useful, unthreatening, small. But something had changed in the room, though nobody else would have noticed it. Katie's jaw had tightened by perhaps a millimeter. Her hands had paused for exactly 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, something older than nursing, something that predated 3 years of careful forgetting, had been reminded of its own existence. She kept an MRE wrapper folded in her locker on the 4th shelf, tucked behind the spare stethoscope. It was from a meals, ready-to-eat that had been dropped in Sanjin Valley in 2010, and she'd used the plastic packaging for something it was never designed for. The wrapper was creased, faded, and she didn't know why she kept it. Muscle memory, maybe. The body remembering what the mind was supposed to forget. Her shift ended at 0700 hours. She clocked out. She drove through rain that hammered the windshield like applause nobody was asking for. She drove to a house that was quiet because it had been quiet for 4 years, since the accident that had taken her husband and his last words to her, "Keep your head down. Protect our son. Promise me you'll just disappear." She'd promised. She'd kept that promise for 3 years and counting. She'd reduced herself to the smallest possible footprint. She'd made herself so unremarkable that people forgot her the instant she left the room. She'd become the kind of person that Ashford was right about, small. Limited. Properly scoped. But now a dog tag on a broken chain was lying in room 347, and somewhere in her body, in the muscle memory of survival, something was beginning to wake up. The dog tag was still there when she arrived for her shift the next morning, clutched in the patient's unconscious fist like a prayer. Katie didn't look at it directly, that would invite questions, but she felt its presence the way soldiers feel sniper scopes. Her hands moved through vitals with mechanical precision, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation. All stable. The patient's name was still listed as John Doe pending identification. She left room 347 and walked straight into the worst day of her career. Dr. Ashford was already making his rounds when she emerged onto the floor, trailing a constellation of medical students who orbited him like he was the sun. Katie had learned to recognize the precise angle of his approach, the way he angled his body to ensure maximum witness. He stopped at room 312 where she was checking a patient's cardiac monitor, and his voice carried the careful clarity of a man performing for an audience. "This is Nurse Morrison," he said to the students without looking at her. "We call her the mouse because you have to wonder if she's actually here or just hiding in the walls." The students laughed nervously, that uncomfortable sound of people unsure if they should be amused. Katie's jaw tightened. She didn't look up from the monitor. Her fingers continued their work, steady, professional, the kind of hands that had held dying men together on tile floors nobody talked about. One measured breath left her lungs. She continued charting, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the words hanging in the recycled hospital air. The group moved on. Ashford glanced back once, searching her face for a crack. He found nothing but composure. She had learned long ago that the trembling comes later, in private, when the witnesses are gone. By noon, the campaign had shifted into something more coordinated. Katie pushed through the break room door with her lunch, a turkey sandwich, apple, the same meal she'd been eating for weeks, and moved toward the table where 6 nurses sat with their phones and coffee cups. Sarah Chen looked up first, made brief eye contact, and something passed between them that felt like an apology. Then Sarah gathered her things. Within 90 seconds, every single person at that table had migrated to different seats, different corners, leaving Katie alone with her sandwich in a room that suddenly felt acoustically hostile. The fluorescent overhead lights buzzed their mechanical hum. She unwrapped the sandwich. Took a bite. The turkey tasted like aluminum foil. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, not from sadness, but from the sheer physiological effort of holding everything down. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, finished half the sandwich in silence, and walked back out onto the floor without breaking stride. The telemetry unit hummed with the sound of vital signs, beeping monitors like a metronome keeping time with her heartbeat. She had absorbed worse than this. Much worse. A break room ambush was nothing compared to the weight of 40 men depending on your hands in an alley where the temperature climbed past 120 degrees and the only sound was breathing and the distant percussion of outgoing fire. But that wasn't the worst part. The formal write-up came at shift change, when the unit board was crowded with incoming and outgoing staff. 20 people minimum gathered as Ashford approached with a single sheet of paper, holding it like evidence in a prosecution. His voice carried the specific tone of someone enjoying his work. He had filed it in response to Katie questioning his medication order that morning, a beta-blocker dosage increase for a patient who was already showing signs of hypertension, whose chart documented a previous adverse reaction to the exact dosage he'd prescribed. She had approached him privately, quietly, with the chart open between them. She had asked if he'd reviewed the contraindication. That question, apparently, constituted insubordination. He read it aloud. Every single word. Nurse Morrison appears to believe that her 3 years of basic floor experience supersedes my 15 years of surgical expertise. Her ongoing pattern of questioning orders creates a dangerous environment of uncertainty. This insubordination and unsafe practice will not be tolerated. He paused, let the silence settle. Formal documentation effective immediately. This matter will be escalated to the hospital board for review. Katie stood perfectly still. Her hands hung at her sides. She made eye contact with him directly, and when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. It didn't crack. It dropped an octave, and every person in that break room heard the shift. The mouse had teeth. "I've seen what real authority looks like, Dr. Ashford," she said. "And you're not it." The room went dead silent. Ashford's face flushed crimson, a terrible red that climbed from his collar upward. His jaw clenched. For a moment, he looked like a man who wanted to speak but didn't know which words would fit through the barrier of his own rage. He turned away without responding and walked back into his office, closing the door hard enough that the sound echoed down the hallway. Sarah Chen stared at her. The other nurses stared. Nobody moved. Then someone's monitor beeped, pulling everyone back into the routine business of keeping people alive. The moment dissolved, but the damage was already done. Ashford was the kind of man who responded to defiance with escalation. That night, as Katie drove home through Philadelphia traffic, her hands finally began to shake on the steering wheel. Not from fear, from the effort of restraint, the massive muscular discipline required to keep everything locked down during daylight hours. Her apartment was dark when she arrived at 11:56 p.m. She unlocked the door quietly, not wanting to wake her 16-year-old son, Marcus, but she found him awake in the kitchen with the refrigerator door open, silhouetted against the cold light. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Just a long shift." He studied her face with the kind of perception that teenagers develop when their parents start falling apart. He didn't press. He closed the refrigerator and went back to bed. The phone call started the next morning. Katie heard about them secondhand, through the hospital's invisible network of gossip and observation. Ashford had called a board member at 6:51 a.m. She knew the time because Sarah had texted her the description. Then another call at 7:15 a.m. to the hospital administrator. Then a meeting that same afternoon where he presented his meticulously documented file, every minor deviation from protocol, every instance where Katie had deviated from standard procedure in favor of patient outcomes, every moment where she'd exercised judgment instead of blind obedience. He had been building this case for weeks, brick by brick, and now he was presenting it as evidence of systematic incompetence. By Friday, Sarah Chen had been reassigned to pediatrics on the 3rd floor. The change was sudden, announced without discussion, framed as resource optimization. Sarah left Katie a note in her locker. "I'm sorry. This isn't on you. Stay strong." By Monday, Katie's access to the ICU had been restricted. Ashford had claimed budget cuts required limiting staff privileges. She had built her reputation in that unit over 3 years, had saved lives in that space, had proven herself through competence and presence and the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing what you're doing. Now she was confined to telemetry, the overflow unit, the place where stable patients went to be monitored by junior nurses who had never seen real crisis. The formal board review was scheduled for Friday at 5 p.m. Katie received the notification via email on Wednesday morning. Routine performance evaluation, it said. She knew what that meant. She had seen it before, in other contexts, in other lives. It meant they were building a case. It meant the outcome was already decided. It meant Ashford had the institutional power to make her disappear from this place the same way she'd been made to disappear from everything else. Wednesday evening, she drove to the cemetery. The grave was in the northeast corner, where the light faded early and the sound of traffic from the highway provided a constant white noise. She knelt in the wet grass, it had rained that afternoon, and pressed her hands against the cold marble headstone. Marcus Williams. Beloved husband. Father. 2003 to 2022. "I promised you I'd keep my head down," she whispered. "I promised you I'd keep our son safe, and I couldn't even do that." Her hands didn't shake. That came later, in the car, driving home through darkness. That came when she was alone. Inside room 347, the patient's vitals remained stable. His chart noted improved neurological response, some reflexive movements, slight changes in pupil reactivity. The dog tag was still clutched in his fist. Nobody had pried it free. Nobody had read the name. It would take another 18 hours before anyone on that unit would understand exactly who was lying in that bed, or what his presence meant, or how thoroughly the ground beneath Dr. Ashford's feet was about to collapse. But that knowledge was waiting. It was moving closer. And in his office late Thursday night, Dr. Ashford reviewed his file against Katie Morrison one final time, added a closing summary in his meticulous handwriting, smiled at the completeness of his work, and scheduled his presentation to the board for the following evening at 5 p.m. sharp. He had no idea that a Navy SEAL team leader was about to wake up. Unsanctioned field medicine. That's what Dr. Ashford called it when he saw Katie Morrison move like someone the hospital had never trained. He didn't know those hands had held pressure on arterial wounds while mortar fire rattled the tin roof of a forward operating base in Marjah. He didn't know the careful documentation he was assembling, the minor protocol deviations, the unauthorized access logs, the carefully timed witness statements, would eventually trigger federal protocols designed to protect a rank that didn't officially exist. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought the entire structure of his power crashing down. The file grew methodically. Dr. Ashford worked with the precision of a man who understood institutional leverage, sitting in his office at 11 p.m. on Tuesday, November 14th, reviewing Katie's telemetry logs from the previous 2 weeks. Here it was, November 3rd at 1847 hours, she'd accessed a crash cart in the cardiac unit without proper notation. November 6th, she'd adjusted a patient's oxygen settings based on clinical observation before calling the resident. November 9th, she'd performed a rapid assessment on a post-op patient that wasn't technically within her scope. Each deviation was small. Each one was documented. Each one proved that Katie Morrison operated with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions without bureaucratic permission. Ashford photographed each page with his phone, building his case like a prosecutor constructing a capital charge. He was not threatened by her competence. He was threatened by her immunity to his authority, and that distinction would cost him everything he'd built. By the second week, he moved against her allies. On Wednesday, November 15th, he casually mentioned to hospital administrator Richard Chen that the ICU needed fresh staffing rotations, better for continuity, he said, better for preventing complacency. Within hours, the 2 nurses who had worked every shift with Katie, who laughed with her at the nurses' station and brought her coffee without being asked, were reassigned to the medical surgical floors. The night shift nurse who had witnessed Katie stabilize a crashing dialysis patient without hesitation was transferred to float pool, working different units on unpredictable schedules. Ashford didn't remove her allies through confrontation. He scattered them like a general breaking up a regiment, using the hospital's own bureaucracy as a weapon. The reassignments looked routine on paper. The devastation was precise. Then came the ICU restriction. On Thursday, November 16, Ashford requested that Katie's credentials for the intensive care unit be temporarily suspended, pending the completion of a protocol review, he explained to Chen, his voice painted with professional concern. She'd been practicing there for 3 years without incident. She knew every monitor, every ventilator setting, every nuance of post-operative management. The ICU was where she'd built her reputation, where the other nurses watched her work and understood that whatever military past she carried, she was exactly where she needed to be. The restriction felt like a blade slipping between her ribs. The ICU was her career foundation. Without it, she was just a floor nurse, rotating through general medsurg, invisible, diminished. Ashford smiled when he received the email confirming the suspension. The file was complete. The stage was set. Katie felt the isolation accumulate like sediment, pressing down in ways that no single incident could have triggered, but the total weight of which became impossible to ignore. By Friday evening, she'd been working the telemetry floor for 4 days straight, outside the ICU, away from her colleagues, in a unit where she knew no one and no one knew the depth of her capability. Her hands, which had moved through complex procedures with the kind of automatic precision that comes from repetition born in survival, now hung at her sides while residents half her age made decisions without asking for her input. The phone calls that had once come to her for guidance stopped coming. The respect that had silently accumulated over 3 years of exceptional care evaporated as though it had never existed. Her 16-year-old son, Marcus, noticed what no colleague dared mention. When Katie came home on Friday at 2,200 hours, he was waiting in the kitchen, and what struck him wasn't her exhaustion, that was familiar, but the way her shoulders curved inward as she set down her badge and keys. "Bad shift?" he asked, the way teenagers do, expecting a surface answer. Katie stared at her hands on the counter for 18 seconds before responding. "Nothing I can't handle," she said, and Marcus heard in that statement not confidence but something else, surrender. She moved to the refrigerator, pulled out water, drank it standing up rather than sitting down. She didn't check her email. She didn't ask about his homework. She sat in the kitchen in her scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something else, something like resignation, and Marcus, who had learned from his mother to read what people weren't saying, understood that something had shifted in her. His mother was disappearing from the inside out. The formal board investigation notice arrived by email on Saturday morning at 0630 hours. Katie read it while Marcus slept, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her jaw moving only in the slight lateral clenches that meant she was calculating. The letter was written in the clinical language of institutional protection, following receipt of documented concerns regarding protocol adherence and scope of practice violations. Oak Creek Memorial Hospital Board of Directors has authorized a formal investigation into your practice patterns. You are instructed to cease all unauthorized clinical decision-making pending review. A hearing is scheduled for November 28. The file was attached as a PDF, 17 pages of Ashford's methodical documentation, each entry timestamped, each one building toward the predetermined conclusion that Katie Morrison was a liability, a rogue clinician, a threat to the hospital's accreditation and insurance standing. She read through the entire file twice. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed level. But something inside her recognized the architecture of institutional destruction, the precision with which Ashford had woven clinical facts into a narrative of incompetence. He had taken her greatest strength, her ability to act decisively in crisis, and reframed it as dangerous insubordination. He had taken her 3 years of perfect safety records and transformed them into evidence of unreported scope violations. He had waited until her allies were scattered across the hospital, until her ICU access was suspended, until she was isolated on a telemetry floor where no one would testify on her behalf. That wasn't bullying. That was strategic dismantling. Marcus found her in the living room an hour later, the letter still open on the coffee table, Katie sitting perfectly still on the couch in her scrubs, still unwashed from the previous night's shift. "Mom." His voice was careful. Katie didn't move. "I'm being investigated," she said quietly. "For practicing outside my scope." Marcus sat beside her, and for a 17-year-old who had spent his entire life never asking questions about his mother's past, the weight of that moment crystallized something he'd always sensed but never articulated. His mother was holding something in, and whatever was happening at the hospital was pulling it out. The telemetry unit was quiet on Sunday evening when Katie returned for her shift, the kind of quiet that preceded crisis. She'd worn her hair pulled back, her scrubs pressed with military precision, her badge clipped at exactly the same angle every day. The other nurses on the unit barely looked at her. The investigation file had spread through the hospital's informal networks like contamination. Everyone had read it, or read about it, or heard about it from someone who had. Katie Morrison, the competent one, the quiet one who sometimes seemed too capable for a floor nurse, had been documented as a protocol violator. The narrative was set. The judgment was rendered. She moved through her shift like a ghost moving through a house it used to occupy. At 0230 hours on Monday morning, November 20th, the code blue alarm sounded from room 347. Katie's hands moved before her brain registered where she was, before her conscious mind could remind her that she wasn't supposed to respond, that she had no access, that her clinical judgment was officially under investigation. The monitor showed a rhythm she recognized instantly, pressure building in the chest cavity, the patient's lung collapsing inward, his oxygen saturation plummeting like a stone dropping through water. The crash cart was 3 seconds away. The chest tube kit another 8 seconds. The on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, was already there, already fumbling with equipment, already frozen in the kind of panic that comes from knowing the right procedure in theory but not having the automatic muscle memory that only repetition under pressure can build. Katie was through the door before anyone could stop her, and her voice, when she spoke, wasn't the deferential tone the hospital had been training her to adopt. It was the voice of someone who had already made peace with consequences. Tension pneumothorax. He needs decompression now. Webb looked up, confused. You're not, but Katie was already moving, her hand steady as a laser, pulling the MRE wrapper from her locker, the one she kept from a habit she'd never broken, from years of keeping emergency supplies in places where emergency supplies weren't supposed to be. She'd carry it for 3 more decades, that wrapper, pulled from a combat ration pack distributed to her unit in 2014, sealed in her locker at a Philadelphia hospital, kept for a moment exactly like this one. Her fingers worked the plastic wrapper into a seal, positioned it with tape, created a one-way valve that would let air escape from his pleural cavity without allowing atmospheric air back in. 90 seconds. The entire procedure took 90 seconds, and by the time Webb understood what was happening, the patient's oxygen saturation was climbing, 75, 82, 88, holding at 91. The patient's wife in the hallway window saw it all, saw her husband's color return, saw the monitor stabilize, saw this woman in scrubs do something that looked like magic but was actually just training, preparation, and the kind of experience that no classroom could ever teach. Ashford arrived within 6 minutes. Katie could hear the administrator calling him. Someone had paged him immediately, summoned him to witness this violation, this proof of her recklessness. He pulled her into the hallway, and his face had that expression of a man discovering that something he'd carefully controlled was now spiraling beyond his grip. What the hell was that? His voice carried the particular venom of someone whose authority had just been publicly challenged. Unsanctioned field medicine with non-sterile materials. You just contaminated a patient with garbage from your pocket. I could have your license for this. Katie stood absolutely still. Her voice, when she spoke, was level and precise. That garbage just saved his life, doctor. The patient's wife was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped in front of her like a prayer. She saved him, the wife said, and her voice carried the kind of conviction that comes from witnessing the impossible. We saw her save him. We saw her save him. What happened next changed the trajectory of every career in that hallway. The intercom crackled at 0230 hours. Code blue. Room 347. The words hit Katie's nervous system like a rifle shot, and her body moved before her mind could argue with the decision. She was 2 floors below, restocking crash carts in the cardiac unit, the shift Ashford had assigned her specifically to keep her away from the ICU where she'd built her reputation. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical drone as she dropped the supply box and started moving. Not walking. Moving. The way soldiers move toward sound. The way her hands found the stairwell railing before she'd consciously chosen to climb. Muscle memory was a language her body spoke fluently. By the time she reached the 3rd floor, 4 nurses were already in room 347, chest compressions in progress on the man with the dog tag. His family stood in the hallway, pressed against the glass, watching their father flatline for the 2nd time in 4 days. Katie read the monitors in a single glance, asystole for 97 seconds. The chest compressions weren't generating meaningful cardiac output. The bleeding beneath the left rib cage, controlled by pressure bandaging since his admission, had ruptured internally. She saw it the way a hawk sees a field mouse from 2,000 feet. Saw the problem. Saw the solution. Saw the window closing. "Step back," she said. Her voice dropped 2 octaves. Not a request. The charge nurse, a woman named Sandra who'd learned to avoid Katie months ago, turned and blinked. "We've got this." Katie was already moving to the bedside. "His pneumothorax is expanding. Pressure's compressing the heart. He's dead in 2 minutes unless we decompress." She reached her locker with muscle memory that didn't belong in a civilian hospital, pulled out the MRE, a meals ready to eat, that she kept for reasons she'd never explained to anyone. Her hands moved like they were performing a procedure they'd done 1,000 times. Because they had. In a forward operating base in Helmand province. In a dust storm that turned day into twilight. On soldiers who weren't supposed to survive but did anyway because her hands knew exactly what to do. The MRE wrapper crinkled as she tore it open. 16-gauge catheter from the crash cart. The plastic sheeting from inside the meal package, watertight, flexible, exactly what you needed when your surgical supplies got buried under rubble and your patient was bleeding into his own chest cavity. She prepped the left chest wall, 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same anatomy she could navigate in darkness because pain is data and her data was perfect. The needle slid in with a whisper. The air escaped with a hiss that sounded like a snake in a locked room. Immediate depressurization. Immediate relief. The pressure bandaging would hold. The improvised seal would keep the atmosphere out long enough for the ICU to stabilize him properly. Long enough for him to live. 43 seconds. That's how long it took. The monitor jumped. Sinus rhythm. Oxygen saturation climbing. 82. 89. 94. The patient's wife in the hallway made a sound like prayer. The man in the bed gasped once, his lungs remembering how to work. Alive. The thing Katie Morrison had spent 17 years learning how to do, keep broken people breathing, she'd done it. Again. Even here. Even now. She stepped back from the bed, and that's when the room temperature changed. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's cologne, his presence like a hand pressing down on everyone's chest. His eyes traveled from the patient to Katie, and she watched his face do the calculation. Watched him understand that she'd just saved a life using a technique that didn't exist in civilian medicine. That she'd taken command in his hospital. That for 43 seconds, she wasn't just a nurse anymore. He smiled like a wolf recognizing a rival in its territory. "What exactly," he said, his voice loud enough for the family to hear, "do you think you were doing?" He stepped into the room, and the air pressure changed again, this time because he was pulling rank with the precision of someone who'd spent decades learning how to weaponize institutional authority. That was unsanctioned field medicine. Completely outside the scope of nursing practice. You don't have privileges to perform invasive procedures. You don't have authorization to override the attending physician's orders. The family stared. Sandra stared. The patient's wife, still crying in the hallway, went very quiet. Katie met his eyes. She didn't speak. She'd learned long ago that words were ammunition, and she'd been ordered not to fire. "Your license is going to be reviewed," Ashford continued, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice like a man savoring a meal he'd spent months preparing. "I'll be filing a formal incident report with the state board. Improper use of equipment. Patient endangerment. Practicing medicine without a license." He turned to the family. "I sincerely apologize for the circus. This won't happen again. I'll be conducting a full investigation into how this employee was allowed unsupervised access to patient care." He left the room. The monitors kept beeping. The patient kept breathing. But Katie could feel something else dying, something smaller, quieter, the kind of thing nobody mourns out loud. Friday morning arrived with bureaucratic silence. Katie opened her locker for the morning shift and found a sealed envelope taped to the door. The hospital logo was sharp and clean. The words inside were sharper, effective immediately. "Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated. The hospital board has reviewed the incident in room 347 in conjunction with Dr. Ashford's documented complaints and determined that your actions constituted a pattern of protocol violations that present unacceptable risk to patient safety. Your final paycheck, minus 2 weeks' notice, will be mailed to your home address. Security will escort you from the building." She read it 3 times. The numbers registered: 17 years of nursing. 3 years at this hospital. 23 days of documented complaints from Ashford. 1 hour, the security guard said, to collect her personal items. She packed slowly. The stethoscope her husband had given her before the wedding. The photo of her son at age 5, holding his first fish. The coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" that she'd bought for $5 at a thrift store. She wrapped them in her uniform jacket, the blue scrubs that had been her armor for so long. The woman at the front desk wouldn't make eye contact. Neither would the security guard who walked her to her car. Shame was contagious in hospitals. It spread through eye contact and silence and the way people suddenly became very interested in their clipboards. The rain started before she reached the cemetery. Philadelphia rain in November isn't gentle. It's accusatory. It hammers the windshield like something with a grudge, and Katie drove through it toward the green space on the east side of the city where they'd buried her husband 4 years ago. Michael Morrison. Beloved husband, father, software engineer who'd married a soldier and never once asked her to choose between him and the ops that took her away for 18 months at a time. Who'd told her, the night before her last deployment, "Come back different. Come back broken. Just come back alive." The mud was cold beneath her knees. The headstone was granite, the color of winter. Her hands pressed against it like the stone could warm them, and she whispered words that the rain absorbed before God could hear them. "I promised you, Mike. I promised I'd keep my head down. That I'd keep our son safe. That I'd be the person nobody noticed, the person nobody asked questions about. I promised I'd leave it all behind." Her voice cracked, only once, only here, only where the rain could hide it. "I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to be safe. I couldn't even do that." The mortgage payment, $1,847 a month. Her son's college fund, $14,300 remaining. Her severance, 2 weeks of pay at $2,100 a week. 3 weeks until the mortgage was due. She'd need work within days or they'd lose the house. "I failed you." She stayed there for 93 minutes. The rain soaked through her jeans. Her fingers went numb. An old woman with flowers passed by and didn't offer help. Nobody offers help in cemeteries. It's the one place where people understand that some pain needs silence, needs time, needs the sound of water on granite. Inside Oak Creek Memorial, 4 miles away, something different was happening. The patient in room 347 opened his eyes for the first time since his arrival. His vitals had stabilized. The improvised seal had held. The surgeons had managed the internal bleeding, patched the pneumothorax properly, given his body the chance to heal. He asked for water. He asked the time. Then he asked the nurse checking his for who stopped the bleeding the first time. The nurse, a woman named Jennifer, didn't hesitate. There's a nurse named Katie. She did something nobody's supposed to be able to do. Improvised it from a meal package. The man's hand moved to his chest, to the dog tag resting there on a broken chain. The letters etched into the metal were worn but legible: Webb, Marcus, 387-43-5541, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. He looked at the numbers on the monitors showing him alive when every military doctor had said the probability of his survival was below 5%. He looked at the broken chain he'd been clutching unconscious for 4 days. He asked for his phone. The call he made was routed through 3 classified networks before it reached a switchboard that hadn't existed officially for 6 years. Authentication codes that didn't appear in any government database. He said a name that should have been erased from every record. Katie Morrison. Yes, that Katie Morrison. A pause. A series of numbers. Authenticate and execute protocol witness guardian. 6 hours later, as Katie Morrison sat in her darkened apartment holding an eviction notice she hadn't opened yet, the exterior of Oak Creek Memorial transformed. Black SUVs with federal plates. Personnel in dark suits. Military officers in dress uniforms that made civilians step aside without understanding why. FBI. DIA. A classification level that lived in the space between what America officially did and what actually kept people breathing. The hospital administrator's phone rang. The board chair's phone. Then Dr. Ashford's phone in his office, where he was reviewing the medication charts for patients he'd authorized for discharge despite concerning lab results. The same investigation Ashford had weaponized against Katie Morrison, designed to examine her unorthodox methods, her protocol deviations, her unsanctioned procedures, triggered federal security algorithms that began pulling his own records. Chart alterations. Surgical errors buried in administrative reports. Patients who died because Dr. Ashford had prioritized his political position on the hospital board over their clinical needs. The records existed. They were just hidden in the places where institutions protect their own. Ashford was reading the last message when his office door opened and a man with a Navy Cross on his dress uniform didn't ask if he could sit down. "Your employment is suspended pending federal investigation," the officer said. "Don't leave the building." The monitor beeped steadily. Room 347. 2:14 a.m. Marcus Webb's eyes opened to fluorescent ceiling tiles and the hiss of oxygen flowing through his nostrils. His hand moved instinctively to his chest seal still in place, edges sealed with medical tape, the improvised dressing holding firm. He'd been unconscious for 37 hours. He remembered the coding, the flat line, the hands that moved like water through fire, and a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. 60 seconds. "Get me a CBC and a chest film." A voice he knew. His fingers found the single dog tag on the broken chain around his neck, the one that had been in his pocket when the medics brought him in. He'd been running it through his fingers for 3 years, every deployment, every hot drop, every night he couldn't sleep. The name etched on it was Katie. Katie Morrison. The major who'd pulled his team out of the Sanjin Valley with rounds popping overhead like fireworks, who'd driven a Humvee through a minefield because stopping meant watching men die in the dirt. He'd thought she was dead. He reached for the phone on the bedside table. His hands were steady, the kind of steady that only comes after you've held a rifle in both palms for long enough. He dialed a number that had been burned into his memory since 2015. A secure number. A number you only used when the world was ending. Falcon Base. Go. This is Eagle 6. Authentication Charlie 79 Delta. Authentication confirmed. Go ahead, Eagle 6. I've got eyes on Eagle 1. Major Katie Morrison. Last location was Marjah, classified. She's alive. She's in Philadelphia. Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. She saved my life 47 minutes ago using field medicine under pressure. Static. Then, say again. The major is alive. And she's a nurse. Within 6 hours, the convoy arrived. 4 black SUVs with government plates. 3 FBI field agents with credentials that made the hospital administrator's face go pale. 2 uniformed Capitol Police. And 1 woman in a charcoal suit who walked through the ER like she owned the building, her badge reading Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterintelligence Division. Katie was in the staff locker room, changing out of her scrubs for the last time, when the overhead intercom crackled, "All personnel. Lockdown initiated. Medical staff report to the main hospital auditorium for mandatory briefing. Repeat. All personnel report to the main auditorium immediately." She stopped, one shoe half-laced, and exhaled. It was over. Whatever this was, whoever they were, it was over. She walked toward the auditorium with the same measured pace she'd used walking into every danger zone, every active operation, every moment her hands had held lives together while bullets sang overhead. The hallway seemed longer than it had been 3 hours ago, the fluorescent lights hissing like serpents in the silence. The auditorium was already half full. 200 hospital staff, nurses, doctors, techs, administrative staff, standing in confused clusters while federal agents positioned themselves at each exit. At the far end of the stage, the hospital administrator stood with the color drained from his face. Dr. Ashford stood 3 feet to his left, his perfect posture beginning to crack, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. Katie took a seat in the back row. The woman in the charcoal suit walked to the microphone. "My name is Special Agent Catherine Reeves, FBI Counterintelligence. We are conducting a federal investigation into a matter of national security. This hospital, its staff, and its records are now under federal seal. No one leaves. No one calls anyone outside this building. Cooperation is not optional." The room erupted. Ashford's hand was trembling now. Katie watched it from her seat, unmoved, her face a mask of polished stone. The mask she'd worn for 3 years. The door burst open from the east corridor. A 16-year-old boy in a hoodie that hung past his elbows stood framed in the doorway, his voice cracking with the kind of urgency only teenagers and warriors possessed. "Mom. They said I could." He stopped, seeing the federal agents. His eyes locked on Katie. And then he raised a locked metal box, the kind you'd use to store important documents or photographs or medals. "They need to see these." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the windows outside. Katie's son walked to the stage. His name was David. He was 16 years old. He had never seen his mother's medals. He had never opened the lockbox his father had entrusted to him with a single instruction: only if she doesn't come home. David turned the key. The medal spilled across the administrator's desk like coins from a shattered casino table. Bronze stars. Purple hearts. Commendations with words stamped across them in official military language. Ribbons that represented deployments and decisions and the specific kinds of scar tissue that only comes from protecting other people's children while your own child waits at home. A nurse, Jennifer, the one who'd brought Katie coffee every morning for 2 years, picked up the first medal with trembling hands. She read aloud, "For valor under fire. For actions taken above and beyond the scope of duty. For the preservation of human life under conditions of extreme hostility." Another, Special Agent Reeves said quietly. "Bronze Star," Jennifer whispered. She picked up the next one. And the next. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. The room began to understand, slowly, like ice cracking across a frozen river. The door opened again. A man in civilian clothes walked through. Tall. The kind of tall that came from carrying weight, literal weight, rucksacks and ammunition and responsibility for most of your adult life. His left arm was still in a sling. His chest was wrapped. His eyes were the color of the Atlantic Ocean after a storm. He walked straight to Katie. "Major Morrison," Marcus Webb said, his voice steady as a sniper's breath. "I want to formally thank you for your service." He turned to the room, his presence filling the auditorium like pressurized air in a sealed space. "Bronze Star," he said, pointing to the medal on the desk. "Marjah, 2015. Major Katie Morrison led a QRF team into a hostile valley during an active ambush. We were taking fire from 360 degrees. She didn't hesitate. She moved. She killed the threat. She saved my team. He paused. The silence thickened. Purple Heart. Marjah, 2015. Shrapnel from an IED detonation. Compound fracture of the tibia. She treated it herself in the field, stayed operational, completed the mission, evacuated the wounded after her own leg was broken. Another pause. The air felt like it was bending. Second Purple Heart. Marjah, 2016. Another mission. Another ambush. She took a round meant for me. 7.62 mm. The scar tissue on her left shoulder is from that moment. She drove a Humvee with one arm and a bleeding shoulder to get 2 Marines to surgical care. They both lived. Jennifer's hands were shaking now. The administrator's face was the color of old paper. I am Petty Officer Marcus Webb, SEAL Team 3. Bravo Platoon. The woman you've been calling just a nurse for 3 years is Major Katie Morrison, United States Special Forces. The quietest person in every room she's ever been in. And 100 of us signed a letter saying we want her back. Special Agent Reeves stepped to the microphone. Dr. Ashford, she said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. During our investigation into Major Morrison's service record, we obtained hospital records you believed were classified. The same investigation the hospital board authorized to terminate her employment has revealed significant anomalies in your surgical record. Ashford's jaw tightened. His hands formed fists, then relaxed. Then tightened again. 14 post-operative complications in 3 years where incident reports were altered before filing, Reeves continued. 6 patient deaths where you were the attending surgeon but transferred clinical blame to nursing staff through falsified documentation. 2 of those cases specifically implicated Nurse Morrison in falsified reports while she was off duty. Jennifer made a sound, a small gasp, like something in her chest had broken. The Jenkins case, she whispered. Yes, Reeves said. Jennifer Martinez was written up for a surgical error committed entirely by Dr. Ashford. That write-up remained in your personnel file for 18 months. You were passed over for promotion twice as a result. The room was beginning to understand. Understanding moved through it like a wave, and where understanding went, anger followed. Dr. Ashford maintained his position as chief of surgery through manipulation of peer reviews, systematic intimidation of subordinates, and the creation of a culture where reporting his errors meant career termination, Reeves said, her voice flat and clinical and devastating. He used his authority to silence better clinicians. To isolate them. To destroy them. Ashford tried to speak. His voice cracked like a teenage boy's. This is, you can't prove. Federal prosecutors are en route, Reeves said. Your privileges are suspended effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building. You will not return. But she wasn't finished. Dr. Ashford is not leaving this hospital as a free man. Federal charges include falsification of Medicare records, obstruction of federal investigation, and criminal negligence in the deaths of 2 patients who would have survived under proper surgical care. You have the right to remain silent. Ashford's perfectly pressed shirt was soaked with sweat now. The kind of sweat that comes from watching your entire world collapse in real time. His eyes darted around the auditorium, searching for allies, finding only contempt. The administrator wouldn't meet his gaze. The surgeons he'd mentored stood with their arms crossed. The nurses he'd intimidated watched him with the kind of focus reserved for predators who'd finally been cornered. 2 FBI agents escorted him out. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just walked, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor, his breathing audible in the silence. Within 72 hours, his medical license was suspended pending revocation hearings. Within 1 week, the story was front-page news in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Renowned surgeon arrested for fraud, military hero nurse was silenced during investigation. The follow-up article detailed every case, every falsified report, every patient whose death had been concealed by a man more concerned with protecting his reputation than with honoring his oath. Katie was in her apartment that evening, her son asleep on the couch beside her, when the hospital called. Major Morrison, the administrator said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that tasted like fear mixed with genuine regret. "I'm calling personally to offer you reinstatement. Director of Emergency Medicine. Full back pay. A formal written apology from the hospital board." Katie's voice didn't change. "It never did. I'll consider it. On one condition." "Anything." "Dr. Ashford works here." Silence. "Then, what?" "He's awaiting trial. He has legal fees. Federal prosecution is expensive. I want to watch him work here as a night security guard for exactly as long as it takes him to understand what it feels like to be invisible." The administrator actually laughed, a small, shocked sound. "I'll make it happen." 7 days later, Katie Morrison walked through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial as Director of Emergency Medicine, her name on a placard in gleaming letters. Her son's photograph was on her office desk beside her husband's. Marcus Webb stopped by that afternoon, fully recovered, moving like someone who'd been given his life back. He handed her a framed letter, signatures in blue ink and black ink and red pen, 100 names, every one of them a warrior who'd served with her, trained under her, been saved by her hands. That first night of Ashford's security shift, he pushed a cleaning cart past the ICU, his polyester uniform hanging from his frame like a flag at half-mast. Katie walked by in her director's coat, her limp still present but her shoulders no longer hunched against the weight of carrying other people's shame. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. His reflection in the window showed everything, a broken man watching the woman he'd tried to destroy walk toward the future he'd tried to prevent her from having. The code blue alarm sounded at 3:41 a.m. Katie moved toward it with the kind of precision that only comes from years of operating under mortar fire, her team following her lead without hesitation, trusting her completely. The quietest person in the room was holding it all together. And everyone finally knew it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you know how this story ends. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, and let me know in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong?